Good evening all and welcome. Don't forget that I have a brand new collection of stickers for you to collect, but hurry because there's less than a week to claim them. To get these cool stickers, just follow the link in the description over to Patreon and join the $10 tier. And you get a bunch of extra perks for signing up. The first people to sign up will also get the old sticker pack for free too, sent to them in the mail. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This story happened 3 years ago. I had just come back from a vacation outside of my city, and my bus dropped me off at the station at around 1:30 a.m. I got to the main road and started looking for a cab to head home, but there was no cab or person in sight. I was standing there for a good 5 to 8 minutes looking both sides of the road, trying to find down a cab, but was unsuccessful. When out of nowhere, to my left, I saw a girl in a white sari, which is a traditional dress for women of my country. She had not been there a moment before, and she was standing around 50 feet away underneath a lamppost. The fact that I had not seen her just moments before were rather ominous, but I told myself that in looking for a cab, I must have simply not noticed her. But my heart immediately started pounding when I looked the other way to look again for a cab and turned back the other way to hear her saying something to me, just feet from me now. She had made it to me in record time and in near silence. My heart was nearly pounding out of my chest in fear when she said, "Can you do me a favor?" I was shaking at this point. I took 2 steps back. It was almost 2 a.m., and this girl in a white sari just sort of materialized to me. She said that she needed to get home, that it was rather late, but would like someone to accompany her, and asked if I could do her this favor. It wasn't far from here. Just for context, at this hour, it's very uncommon to see women out alone at night, simply because it can be quite a dangerous place for a woman by herself at this hour. Knowing this, despite being afraid, I walked with her, fearing for her safety if I didn't. We walked. I didn't want to talk or make eye contact. I didn't even ask her where she was going. I just followed her, walking next to her but keeping a distance. She didn't say a word the entire time we traveled, which was eerie. After walking for maybe 15 minutes, we reached a steel gate. She made a happy face and said that she lived not too far from here and thanked me. She turned back around and started walking. I thought my job was done and began walking in the opposite direction to try and look for my cab again. But curiosity panged me in the chest, and I wanted to know which direction she was traveling in specifically from here. As I turned my head around, mere seconds after her departure, I looked to see no one there. I looked at the steel gate and couldn't see her past the distance, which would be unlikely given the few seconds that had passed since me seeing her last. When I took a closer look at the gate, I noticed there was a chain and padlock around it, so there's no way she could have unlocked it, locked it again and gone through in that minimal amount of time. That's when I looked up and saw the sign over the gate, and it said it was a cemetery. Then I started running. I saw a mosque in the distance, and thinking that would be a safe haven, I ran towards it, opened the doors, and fell to the floor. The imam or priest came to greet me with a baton, thinking I was a thief. When he saw me on the floor, he spoke to me and asked what happened, and I explained everything to him. He understood and told me the following story. 8 years ago, a girl was sexually assaulted and her life taken. People found her limp body underneath the lamppost. The same lamppost I had seen her at earlier. Her face was messed up. No one could identify her and no one came to claim the body. No complaint was filed to the police, and the people responsible still roam free. Since no one claimed the body, the locals buried her in the cemetery. Since then, a lot of people, especially young guys, have had interactions with her. Some hostile, some peaceful. I'm glad that mine was otherwise, and I don't think I'll be forgetting in a hurry my interaction with the late night girl. I'm from a small town in Iowa with around 7,000 people. When you grow up in a small town, you become really resourceful at finding fun things to do. You make the most of fun while you're having it. Urban legends are plentiful and always fun to hear. I don't live far from our capital city, and as I got older I started venturing into the city. I made a lot of friends and they loved hearing the stories of me growing up in such a small town and the fun things we did. They would beg me to take them to a cemetery about 40 minutes from our house. It's a place that I'd only been to a handful of times. I admit that in the daytime it's very innocuous. I know the area somewhat well, as I've hunted out there and been on quite a few late night drives too, but by night it becomes very creepy. I will state this now, I'm not going into the supernatural if something creepy happens to look at me. I'll look for a logical explanation. If you tell me a haunting story, I'll roll my eyes, but there is no explanation for this one. So one evening, some friends from the city call me. They want to go to this cemetery and they want me to take them out there. I agree, so they make their way down to me and we all go around 8 p.m. This is in mid-fall, so it's somewhat dark at this time. We stand around having a few smokes and catching up with one another, and there are 5 of us, and around 9 p.m. we leave. Part of this trip is on a paved highway, but the rest is on limestone, gravel roads, and about 6, maybe 10 miles at most to the graveyard. We took my friend's new car at the time. It was a few months old and was a reddish maroon Pontiac G6. If you've ever drove on a limestone gravel road, you'll know that your car will get covered in a fine white dust. We make it to the cemetery. The entrance is a large cast iron gate. So we go in and I show them the headstone. It's a very large one from the early 20th century, and it has a very creepy saying on it. Something like, "Where you are now, I once was, and soon you will be where I am." Since reading it, I found out it's a pretty common thing on old headstones. My friends are in agreement. Yeah, that's really creepy. They ask if anything has ever happened to me out here. No, not really. My car once overheated by driving it, but that's about it. Now, this gravestone sets in the last rows facing west, and to the south, maybe 50 yards, are a whole row of children's small graves, just big enough to fit names on the stones that were quite small too. Well, urban legend says if you run between those graves, zigzagging through them, you will die. My friend starts trash talking, telling me that's the dumbest thing he's ever heard of. He yells he's not afraid of any stupid dead babies. I said, I don't know, man. I always heard that whenever someone did it, they were dead a week later. He tells me I'm an idiot. He starts running through them and gets halfway and says he could care less about the supposed curse, but he doesn't complete the whole run and comes walking back. We joked with him and asked him if he's too scared to do it, and he says, yeah, I got creeped out halfway through. We went back to the entrance, had a few smokes, shot the breeze a minute, and I was ready to leave. I hadn't had dinner, and I was getting hungry. It was around 11 p.m, and we headed back to the town I live in. On the south side of town, there's a McDonald's. I pull in and we head in to have dinner. When we leave the car, it was under a street light, and the car was well lit. When we get to it, a friend noticed there were small handprints all over the car, no fewer than 20. They were the size of a 2-year-old's, but not all were the same size, but all were very small. They were on top of the trunk, on top of the roof. You could see them because they were outlined in the dust from the gravel road. I remember looking really close, and you could see fingerprints in the white dust, highlighting every crease, and it's the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. There's no explanation. If they were there before we went out, they would have been covered by the dust. We couldn't figure out how a kid could have gotten on top of this car. There are no kids around where the owner of the car lived, nothing. We tried to come up with a reasonable explanation as to how they would have been there, but nothing made sense. I told my friend that ran through the graves, he better watch out. To this day, if you bring it up with him, he won't hear a word of it and will leave the room or get angry that you brought it up with him. And we're close to 20 years since that happened. My sister and I shared an experience that we will never forget. When I was around 7, my sister 9, and my family moved into a house that was beside a huge cemetery. I'm talking thousands and thousands of bodies buried here, along with a mausoleum that probably had 100 people in it. You couldn't see our house from the road as it was hidden by trees, but our driveway was long, and as you drove up our driveway you would literally read headstones. It was convenient for my family at the time because my dad worked at this cemetery as a gravedigger. As young kids, my sister and I weren't scared of this house nor the cemetery. We hadn't really ever been exposed to the idea of paranormal things yet. We actually would spend a lot of time walking around the cemetery and the fountain that was there. We would also go visit our dad while he was at work, but my parents were kind of off-put about the house once we started living there. I remember them mentioning how there were holes in the corners of the room, like the previous owner had cameras in the house. But as kids, we didn't really get why this would be weird. My mum's mum lived with us at the time. We called her Nanny. She had strokes in the past and was kind of frail. She couldn't walk that well and needed assistance doing certain things. She was just really weak, but at this point in time her mind was still sharp. My nanny's room and my sister's room were connected by a bathroom, so each room had a door to the bathroom. One day my parents went to grocery shop and left us with Nanny to watch us. It probably wouldn't have been a good idea to do that, but my sister and I were pretty well behaved. We wouldn't do anything bad or give her a hard time. My sister and I were sitting in the middle of my sister's room playing on the floor, when all of a sudden the bathroom door that was closed began shaking violently, like someone was grabbing the doorknob and shaking it as hard as they could. We immediately got up and went for Nanny. She was sitting in the room watching TV, and we stayed in her room until my parents came back. I know for certain it wasn't her, because she would have said so. Even then, there's no way she would have been able to shake the door like that. She was just too weak. My sister had other things happen in that house, like figures peeking in at her through the crack in her bedroom door. We would also see a little girl with black hair most of the time, not even inside our house, mostly outside around our house. That was the only paranormal thing that I've ever experienced, but to me, it's significant, especially because I wasn't the only one to witness it, and my nanny was there to verify that it wasn't her. Before I start my encounter, I want to explain something first. My granddad on my dad's side sadly passed away when my dad was only 13, and me growing up didn't know who he was at all. I knew that he'd been in the Royal Navy, and other than that was a mystery man to me. At that point I never wanted to ask my dad nor uncles or my nan about him, as my nan never loved again after his tragic passing. I remember when I was a young child, around 4 or 5 at the time, my nan had a picture on her bedside table with herself and a few people in a bar somewhere. There were 2 men in the picture, never really knowing which one was my granddad. Now on to the main story. This happened in 2012, and that would make me around 18 at this time. Me and my younger brother Dom, aged 13, went to our local cemetery. It sounds morbid, but we were up there with good intentions, as our older brother Lewis and great uncle Tom were buried up there, and we used to show our respects by cleaning the graves and removing weeds that covered them. Soon after we'd finished, Dom wanted to go to the toilet, and the graveyard, luckily enough, had a toilet on the far side. As we approached, I had a weird feeling of being watched, and when Dom tried to open the toilet, to our surprise it was locked. This rarely ever happened. This was bad. He was desperate, and our house was 20 minutes away, so I told him to pee round the back of the toilet and that no one would see him. Then in the corner of my eye, 10 meters away, I see this guy staring at me. I turned to face him, and it was almost like a staring competition. how he just kind of reminded me of my dad's brother, Uncle Andy, but I knew it wasn't him, as he lived 2 towns away, would have come up to me and asked why in the graveyard, and the guy wasn't wearing glasses, as my uncle has to wear otherwise he can't see. So I turned to Dom and asked him what's taking so long, and when I turned back, the guy in question had vanished. Several weeks later, my brother and I asked my Nan about our mysterious granddad, so I reminded him that if Nan didn't want to talk about it, to just drop it. Like I said before, I didn't want to upset her, so my brother goes to talk to my Nan, and I hear my brother call me, so I go towards her bedroom, and as I walk in, she's smiling and happy to show pictures of herself and my dad and my uncles, and then one caught my eye. It was my granddad. It looked just like the guy who was staring at me in the cemetery. Could it have been? A number of years back, I used to work in an office that was right near a cemetery. I didn't get along well with my co-workers and would often buy lunch downstairs and eat it on one of the benches in the cemetery, as it was quiet, peaceful, and I was generally not disturbed. After finishing my sandwich one day, I'm just having the last few sips of my coffee and staring at something on my phone when I hear a baby crying. At first, I pay no notice. Surely a parent with a baby walking through the cemetery is nothing to cause alarm. But the baby just keeps on crying. Those lungs keep on giving, and after about a minute or two, I decide to turn around to see what's going on, as no one has made any attempt to appease this baby. I slowly turn around and see a baby on top of a grave plot. This really freaked me out. A baby crying on a grave plot. I look around, but there's no one to be seen. I get up slowly to have a better look around and start making my way towards the baby to see where the parent is, but I don't see anyone. I'm really starting to feel uncomfortable. I heard a lot about scams in my area where people would leave a baby to cry in the middle of the road or somewhere secluded to then jump them from the bushes and rob them. I really didn't want this to be me, and in a moment of panic, decided the best thing to do would be to call the police. I kept looking around the bushes and trees as the baby kept on wailing. I locked eyes with the baby and started punching in 999 on my phone. When I hit dial, it immediately was answered by an operator. I started telling her that there was a baby crying in the cemetery, and she asked my location. When I shared it, she told me someone would be there soon. I waited, not wanting the baby to go anywhere. I could still hear it crying. When I got off the phone, I looked at the baby and kept looking around the trees and bushes. I was contenting myself that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, and for who knows what reason this baby had been abandoned in the graveyard, maybe for someone to find. So I told myself that if no one was here within a few minutes, it would have to be me who goes and picks it up. I started walking towards this baby when a rustling from behind me made me jump, but it was just a squirrel. The moment I turn around, the baby and the noise are gone. I just about crapped a brick. There is no conceivable way a crying child could have been there one moment and then not the next. I swear my body flooded with adrenaline, and I'm ashamed to admit that I just froze on the spot, unable to do anything, my mind whirring at 1,000,000 miles a minute as to how the hell a baby was there a moment ago and not there now. What the hell was I going to say to the police? I just about found the courage to break out and started running towards my office. I made it, but it was still lunch break, so didn't go in, and just stared at the cemetery, seeing if the baby would magically reappear, which it did not. A few moments later, a police officer arrived, and as they got out of the car, I approached them and told them that it was me. I babbled, and when they asked for clarity, I explained that I saw and heard a baby, but then the baby was gone. I was expected to get scolded, maybe even brought in for wasting their time, But something in this police officer's look told me that that wouldn't be the case. She looked at me and just kind of shook her head. I asked her what was up, and she explained that that had been the third sighting of a baby at this graveyard in the past year. Something creepy was definitely going on, but I never got more out of the police officers as they left shortly after. I never went to the cemetery to have lunch again, and never heard the crying baby as I avoided the area. But I wonder if the baby still cries out from its grave. For as long as I can remember, the unexplained seemed to surround me, and because of that, I have my fair share of stories. Most are not as comforting as the one I'm about to tell you. Where I live, we have a cemetery that sits back from the road, hidden within the forest of trees that line a peaceful and beautiful creek. The 13 unmarked graves is a tale that not many of you know. The legend goes that if you visit the cemetery during the day, 12 graves will you count, but if you remain at night, 13 you'll find. Just a creepy tale that has people curious about the legend. Most of the graves within the cemetery date back to the Civil War, if I remember correctly, and the newest grave I have found within the gates of the cemetery was 1945. I love visiting the cemetery because it's something that truly brings me peace when I'm there, and one of these visits leads me to the story that I am about to share. The orange, yellow, and red and brown leaves littered the ground as the trees that surrounded the cemetery slowly wept them as the seasons began to change. It was a beautiful, sunny day with a comfortable temperature. It wasn't too hot, but wasn't too cold. My parents and I had decided to go for a drive, a normal routine when you live in a town that has nothing really to do. We had been to the cemetery before, so when my dad suggested we go to the cemetery and look at the gravestones once more, we thought nothing of it. Upon our arrival and exiting the vehicle, I did what I always do, count the 12 unmarked graves just to see if there are still 12. Silly, I know, but it had become habit. When entering the cemetery, my parents and I usually split up, as it's a good-sized cemetery. My dad stays towards the back near the vehicle. My mum moves towards the middle, and I move towards the front nearest the road, and all we do is stroll, looking at the graves and see where the people were born and where they passed. Some people consider this weird to do, but to us it's fascinating. Nothing felt out of the ordinary that day. I had to put a considerable amount of distance between my mum and me as I moved down the row of graves, paying attention to their names. I was in my own little world, finding being in my element, nature, a way to let the stress seep from my body. The soft wind moving through the trees and the sound of the water rushing in the nearby creek was truly heaven for me. But that feeling of being ordinary would vaporize into a feeling of being watched. It started with the hair slowly rising on the nape of my neck, my body instantly reacting to the sudden change in my environment. Naturally, I looked up from the grave that had caught my attention. A soldier that had fallen in the Civil War. He wasn't very old, from how the grave read, but the grave had caught my attention, and I spent more time just appreciating the stones that showed wear and tear. But anyway, I tore my eyes from the gravestones and instantly looked towards where my parents were. None of their eyes were looking back, both heavily focusing on graves as they moved along very nonchalantly. Instantly I peered around, not moving from my spot as I looked for the cause of my physical distress. I looked at the scene before me, bringing my eyes slowly around the graveyard until I noticed a beautiful oak tree that was by the creek. It was just an ordinary oak tree, but what was standing beside it made my heart stop. There was some distance between me and him, a young man that stood slightly taller than me, and I'm 5'10". He had blonde hair that shone in the sun and striking facial features. Our eyes locked, and honestly, I thought he was just a normal person, until I let my eyes slowly drop down along his frame. That's when I noticed the uniform that I'd seen in so many history books. The dark blue coat, hung on his frame, and the lighter blue pants were just as baggy as the coat. His hat matched the coat, a kepi, I think that's what they called it. As my eyes found his face, I noticed I wasn't scared. I honestly was more curious about who this gentleman was and why he was watching me. I just looked at him, and he looked at me, and it felt like hours, but was probably only a minute before I heard my name being called by my dad saying it was time to go. I tore my eyes away from the man who was studying me, as I wanted to hear my father, and when I looked back, the man had vanished, only leaving the memory and doubt of what I'd seen. When I was around 9 years old, I was going to my first funeral. While I was there, I wandered off from the group and went to someone's gravestone and saw the picture of a person and flowers with a small peace offering. At the time, I didn't know it was disrespectful to take flowers from a person's gravestone, and it wasn't explained to me either. So I reached down to grab a daisy that had grown over this person's grave and pulled on the stem of the flower. I found that there was some sort of resistance in doing so pulled even stronger, and to my surprise, that daisy slipped out of my hand and went into the dirt, as if someone had been pulling it from underneath. I was so confused by it that I put my hand over where the daisy had been moments ago. Needless to say, it left an impression on me, so I was never disrespectful at a cemetery again, but also it made me realize what an eerie place cemeteries can be. I went back to the group and acted as if nothing had ever happened. Looking back, I think my intentions were to give the flower to my mum, but I didn't understand the implications of what it meant to take these flowers from someone's grave. My family moved from Kansas to Tennessee in the year 2000. I made some friends at my new high school, and we were all hanging out on Halloween. Someone told us a local legend called the Ghost Flame. A few of my new friends wanted to check them out, and they invited me to go with them. I was skeptical but went out of curiosity. The legend goes like this. There's a haunted cemetery way out in the boondocks. If you park on the side of the gravel road at the entrance and turn off your headlights, you can see a ghost flame hovering over a grave. It sounded like someone was trying to pull a prank on me. One of the guys borrowed his dad's car and we all drove out there. We parked at the entrance and cut off our headlights and waited about 5 minutes and someone shouted, "Oh my God, look!" There it was. A tall flame hovering above a grave just in front of the headstone. The driver of the car turned the headlights on and the flame instantly disappeared. He turned them off and it slowly came back on. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but the skeptic in me didn't want to be the butt of some practical joke, so I walked up to the cemetery to check it out. As I approached this flame, I could see that it was actually hovering about 6 inches off the ground and was a pretty real tall flame. Not short like a candle, more like a torch flame. As I got closer, it began to dim, until it went out, as I walked up to the grave. I thought surely someone had set a torch of some kind on the ground, but there was nothing. I would have seen or heard someone running off into the woods. The graves were all too small to hide behind. The grave was a large granite slab, so nothing could be buried in the ground. I could not come up with a logical explanation. The other kids in the group was just as dumbfounded as I was. We weren't really terrified, we were more in awe and disbelief than anything. I've never seen anything so bizarre in my life. That was so long ago. I was new to the area and didn't know where I was, so I don't remember where the cemetery was. But I think I've located it using Google Earth. Skeptical thoughts and similar encounters are welcome. If anyone lives here in Robertson County, and you've heard of the legend, please let me know. For context, I used to live in a very small town, and this is where the story takes place. I met this girl at work when I worked at McDonald's called Lacey. We hit it off, and after some innocent flirting, she invited me over to her house to watch a movie as a date. I was only 19 at the time. I'm very nervous, as this would be the first date I'd go on as an adult, none of that kid stuff anymore. So, on the night in question, after she told me where she lived, I realized we didn't live that far from each other, as I said, small town. Now, to get to her house from mine, I'd have to walk a few streets and then the big park in the center of town, past the cemetery which was connected to the park, and a few roads over to get to her house. It was around a 20-minute walk at most, and calculating the route, told myself to leave half an hour. So at 6:30, crippled with anxiety, I left the house and started making my way as the sun was starting to set. When I was passing through the graveyard, I saw some flowers on a grave when it struck me that I hadn't bought anything to give her, not a bottle of wine, nothing. This was a mistake. So I panicked, and I looked down at the flowers. They had just been left in the plastic wrap over a grave. I didn't even hesitate. I was young, naive, and jumped the fence over to the cemetery, and grabbed the flowers, which had also still had the price on them, and made my way to her house, smug with my recent acquisition. I told myself the dead wouldn't be missing these. I gave her the flowers, and she thanked me and put them in a vase with water. Then we had a few drinks, had some food, and she made popcorn, and we sat down on her couch, about to pick a movie. As she was scrolling through the options, I sat there, nervous, because I really wanted to kiss her. We picked a movie, I don't remember which, and as we started playing, I know that my main focus was just trying to get my arm behind her head, to see if maybe I could initiate something. I had gotten the vibes that maybe that she wanted to as well, but I couldn't be sure. That point aside, I wasn't paying attention. These thoughts were just running through my head, trying to build the courage to extend my arm over to behind her neck. That's all I could think about. When, as the movie was playing, in a particularly dark scene, I see in the reflection something walk behind us. I'm a little confused. One of the first things she told me when I got there is that her mum and dad were out and wouldn't be back for 2 more days. I thought this was great, carte blanche with no parents home, but seeing that sent a chill down my spine. I asked her, "Hey, does anyone else but your parents live here with you?" "No," she replies, "just us." I decide to stay quiet, to not freak her out. But suddenly the focus of my attention was no longer that. It was now honing in on whatever the hell I had just seen. I was still gazing at the TV and thinking about my next move when something happened unexpected. The vase where I had put the flowers fell and shattered onto the ground. It made both of us jump. I physically screamed. We both got up to check it out. She paused the movie and looked at me in disbelief. "But I put them in the middle of the table." The vase, you see, was on the floor, at least a meter away from where it had been. I looked at her and she looked at me. And at that moment, deciding that this was way too spooky, I decided to tell her that I had seen something walk behind us just after I asked her that question in the reflection of the TV. She started panicking. I told her that it would be alright, and that nothing spooky was going to affect her. I don't know how I was ever going to live up to that promise, but I was feeling brave in that moment, as she was quite afraid. So the evening went that we picked up all the glass shards, put the flowers in another, smaller vase, and decided to cuddle up on the sofa. With her being scared, this meant that I could have my arm around her shoulder much easier than before. The next morning I'm walking back home, and as I'm making my way, I look over and intentionally look at the grave where I'd taken the flowers from. Something from within me panged, and I realized that maybe I had been a bit crass in taking the flowers from someone's grave. I'm unsure whether it was just coincidence, my mind playing tricks on me, or the guilt I maybe chose to oppress. But in that moment, I looked down at the grave and saw the name of the person. June Sams. She had died only a few months ago, at the tender age of 9. That somehow made everything worse. So, I turned back, went to a local supermarket, got a much larger bunch of flowers and a Barbie. I put the Barbie and the flowers on the grave, said sorry, and carried on making my way home. I'm unsure if I appeased the ghost or if it was all in my mind, but I had no spookiness from there on. Neither did Lacey. We never really worked out in the end. But even so, to this day, it remains one of the creepiest things that has ever happened to me. Whether I made it happen to myself or not, I will never know by taking those flowers. But nonetheless, I have learnt to be more respectful and don't take things from the dead anymore. Both me and my friend like taking pictures of abandoned buildings because we're weirdos like that. Well, there's this old abandoned mental hospital from the late 1800s, early 1900s, about 5 hours away from where we live, and we decided to go there for a weekend. So the weekend comes, and since our parents are friends as well, they decide to come along. We drive halfway across Virginia and finally reach this place. We're walking around outside and decide to go check out the old graveyard where they buried all the patients, and which was in a wooded area. They also did some pretty messed up experiments on the patients as well, which I think was pretty common for mental hospitals back in the day. Anyway, we're walking along the path in the graveyard when I notice something white sticking out of the ground. My mum, a former X-ray technician, looks at it and says, "Oh, that looks like a human arm bone." And then I say something like, "Oh, that's nice." I really wasn't shocked or scared, I was just thinking, this is a graveyard, graveyards have bones in them. And the rest of the trip was really fun, except for the redneck who yelled at us for pulling over in his property for a second because we were lost. Still, it was a little bit unsettling to find that. About half a mile up the road from my house is a small cemetery where most of my family is buried, as well as a few other families in my community. It's a very rural area, surrounded by cow pastures on 3 sides and an orange grove across the road. There's a chapel in the front, which is more or less just a pole barn with 2 rows of benches under the roof. It gives shade and seating for holding a service. A few months back I was driving home from work. It would have been around 11:30 at night. As I passed the cemetery, I saw her, a thin woman sitting in the front row of the chapel. She had a white sundress, a big floppy hat that covered her face, and a luggage bag by her side. There was no one else in the cemetery, no cars around, and all 2 houses on the road were dark. I didn't feel threatened or scared or anything, but it was enough to make my hair stand on end as I drove past. I don't know why, but I started thinking about her again the last few days. I don't know who she was waiting for, but I hope they found each other. This happened to me last night. I was with my best friend walking, and we decided to go to her grandma's cemetery to light a candle for her. We were walking down the street to the cemetery, ready to enter, and she tells me that she saw something before we entered the cemetery. I told her that she was just freaking out, and we were walking towards the grave, when I heard something and decided to look. It was 9:30 p.m. My friend had taken a few steps forward and I was horrified. Near a grave was a dark figure with a very white face, and I froze. My friend noticed that I stopped, and that I was frozen, and she kept calling to me. I didn't speak or move, and after a few seconds I told her we needed to leave. She asked me what was wrong, and all I could tell her was that we needed to leave. A few moments later I told her what I saw, and she told me to leave because she had seen the same thing. That thing was watching us both leave the cemetery and we began to run. I'm not the type to believe in the supernatural, but what I saw and what she saw left us both speechless. To give some background, we went to Independence Cemetery in Indiana, something we often do on the 4th of July, since we were all confused about plans for the night, and my partner's mum suggested we should go. I've only been there 3 or 4 times myself, and this was the first time I had been out of the car when we got there, since their mum and their dad never really let us since the energy is always off. This time their father didn't join us, and I was able to escape into the humid night to dick around freely while my partner followed me around. I taunted ghosts and whatever was listening, being the Shane to the Ryan of this time adventure. I do this often too. My partner doesn't really condone my dumbery, they find humor in it. My partner took pictures of me acting dumb, crouching and pretending to be rabid as I whistled at the arse crack of night and taunted, generally just being a nuisance and an idiot to get a good laugh out of myself and my partner to ease the mood. I left the next day heading back to my house since my parents had gotten home from Michigan and I had things to do with them that afternoon. I had finished cleaning the house and my partner messaged me, showing me a picture and asking what the hell I saw. I looked closely into the darkness and thought it looked like a corpse, though this could be the saturation being turned up slightly. We talked about it being any number of things, but my point still remained, that maybe after our tomfoolery, perhaps something wanted to make an appearance to scare us, even though it didn't get the chance. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's collection of stories. If you did, please let me know down below. I would like to again point out the sticker collection that I have on offer for you guys. If you would like to receive these funky stickers that we made, just sign up to the $10 tier on Patreon and you get a whole bunch of extras included too. But that's it for today. I want to give a huge thank you again to my patrons and members for joining. It really means a hell of a lot, so thank you all. But that's it from me. There are more videos on screen for you to watch if you are so inclined. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.